Two of my favorite principles when it comes to improving performance in a multitude of ways is the specificity principle. If you are a runner training in a way that's specific to the movement pattern and the end result that you're trying to create, right? That's being as specific as possible to your goal. And there's also variability. Variability is the complete opposite of that. It's moving in a well-rounded way or doing things outside of running to help create that foundation to hopefully become a better runner. So for instance, from a variability standpoint, you've heard me talk about wearing different types of shoes, exposing the body and the foot to different forces, different stresses, different ways to need to stabilize and control itself. You also heard me talk about playing different sports. I have some runners that play pickleball, some that shoot hoops and play basketball, some that play adult league soccer, right? That just do different things that are not specific to running. They're moving in different ranges of motion, different planes of motion, exposing themselves to different stresses. From a movement standpoint, I think variability is super important. In fact, I almost put it at the bottom level of the pyramid. A lot of times you hear me say, in order to achieve a higher peak, we must build a wider base. I think in that base is just teaching yourself and training yourself to be a good, well-rounded athlete. If I have a good, well-rounded athlete, I can teach them to be more specific in something. But if I have someone that's only good at one thing and they don't have the base to be able to translate that to a whole range of movements, their peak is probably pretty limited, right? Because they don't have that big foundation in place. What I want to do today is I want to show you actually three movements that I look at from a variability standpoint. These are things that end up in a lot of my clients' programs that have really nothing to do with running. They're not specific to the movement pattern of running in any way, right? In fact, we probably don't do these. It doesn't really correlate to running very much, but in my opinion, it helps them create a very good base so then we can get more specific over time and work towards helping them become better runners. So first thing is a lateral squat or lateral lunge, right? You never see a runner. Trail runners, possibly, we can debate this a little bit. Will move laterally as they dodge trees and sticks and roots and rocks and those kinds of things. On the road, right? It really never happens. But what we want to do is we're always moving forward, right? Our hips are always moving. Our knees are always moving in this action here. They're flexing, extending. That's very sagittal plane focused. If we only train that way, we're going to lose range of motion. We're going to lose the capacity of this hip to move in a variety of ways. So we're only teaching it to do one thing all the time. So that's why I like the lateral squat. It breaks us out of that sagittal plane. It helps us move in the frontal plane, right? You can see how wide I am side to side to help really maintain or improve the capacity of that hip, that ball and socket joint to move and experience different positions. So it's very healthy from a hip standpoint. We can build range of motion, also build strength and stabilization. So when performing the lateral squat, you can see I just started by going in this nice long, just wide position here. As long as my feet will stretch, I'm actually going to step one foot forward slightly. So this is going to be the side that I lower down to. My right foot's forward. Instead of having my toes straight ahead, I'm going to open up the hip joint, let those toes come out. It's going to allow me to move into the hips a little bit more freely. From here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit back, butt back, drive my knee out in line with that foot, sit down to that lateral squat, and then push out from that leg. Big stretch through the groin, adductors. I'm strengthening all these glute muscles, all of these groin muscles. I'm moving myself in a completely different plane of motion than running. For a lot of my runners, this tends to get into the program, right? We do it as a foundational piece, make sure they can do it and do it well, add some weight to it. It also ends up in the program as they run higher mileage. They're only running forward for 20, 30, 40, 60 miles a week. Let's get them to move in some different ways just to make sure we're not overloading those sagittal plane muscles. We're maintaining the integrity of our movement, of our joints and muscles by moving laterally. If I was to do that on the other side, toes out, wide stance, butt back, and obviously seeing if you notice any difference from one side to the other side. You'll notice some people are like, oh, I can only get down this far on this side, other side I can get deeper. Okay, you know, we have some type of imbalance there. We need to address that. We're more weak or we're tighter to that side or that position. The other side, let's do a second set to that one. So that's the first one, is the lateral lunge. Good way to move in that frontal plane, right? Lateral base movement, which we never see as we run, just to help really create that foundation for better movement in the future. Next two movements are what we call end range movements. So from a running standpoint, it's a very mid-range sport, which means if we look at the range of motion, we're flexing the hip probably about that much. We're coming down, we're pushing off, we're extending the hip that much. I'm not actually going through my hip's whole range of motion. I'm only going through a small piece of it. That's where the debate comes in. How much do we actually need to stretch to be a successful runner? We learned that stretching does not prevent injury, but also runners, we probably don't need to stretch a whole lot just because we're not using a whole lot of range of motion. We need that at the big toe, we need that at the ankle, and we need to be able to extend a few degrees to push off. Other than that, we don't need a whole lot of flexibility. With that being said, from a foundational standpoint, I have found that people have a really tough time internally rotating into their hips and then also strengthening their hamstring in a very shortened position. So these are end range exercises. So if we started by showing you the 90-90 hip internal rotation liftoff, that's that 90-90 position. I talk about this one quite a bit. Very good position to work on rotation of the hips. Again, we don't go into this position a whole lot. As runners, we're mostly moving straight forward, so don't get a whole lot of rotation at the hips, which could be a reason why you need it just from a foundational standpoint to maintain good integrity of your hip joint, strength, stability, and also mobility. What we can do here from this, we're trying to work on actually the back leg by lifting that back foot and work on internally rotating this ball in the socket. So depending on how tight I am in this position, I can get up right here. This is the hardest position to be in. I can make this easier by putting out a kickstand, right? Bringing that arm out to the side, making this position easier. I'm not as aggressive into my position now, so it's less stressful, there's less range of motion required. So it really depends on what you need in this 90-90 position to be successful. So I'm going to start here just in the midway point. I'm going to put my hand out to the side to ease off. I'm going to engage the core, irradiate glutes, core, shoulder, everything create tension, because all I want to do is internally rotate this hip. So if I can create tension throughout the whole system, I can then move this hip through a greater range of motion because all of these other segments and joints are stable or stiff, whichever way you want to look at that. So from here to internally rotate, create tension, irradiate, lift, 3-second hold, and lower. Lift, 3-second hold, and lower. Over time, as that internal rotation improves, I can, because we're looking at improving the end range of motion as opposed to moving through the full range of motion, I can then set myself up higher. So, okay, Garrett, you can do that. Yeah, you can do pretty well with that position. Let's actually start you up in a greater degree. I'm already internally rotated at the hip here. Irradiate. Oh, man, that's hard. Now I need to try to lift off something a little bit higher so I can work on perfecting this. You should see what that, or feel what that's like in the hip here. When you're at the end of that range of motion, you're really trying to work on holding that last bit of range of motion. We usually never move there as runners. So getting ourselves to become more familiar with that end range. Again, how much is it going to improve running directly? I'm not sure, right? We're not actually doing something that's specific to running, but from a foundational standpoint, improving the function of our body, the capacity to be able to move in different planes of motion, to have just this strong musculoskeletal system can then only be enhanced with more specific training in the future. That's where I think moving in different ways is helpful. So that's all it is here. Internal rotation, lift off. Okay, hold for 3 seconds. Next one in last one, knee flexion, passive range lift off. So I'm actually going to grab this is going to be a mismatch, but that's completely fine. A couple dowels here, PVC pipe and a dowel. Don't mind them being different. With this one, what I see with a lot of people is hamstring weakness as their knee is in this flexed position. So if I was in Las Vegas and I was going to place a bet on something, say, hey, I want to test 100 people in these rooms, I bet 90 of those 100 will cramp in their hamstring as we test their strength in a shortened position. If I get people on the treatment table and I have to do every evaluation, I'm very cautious as I test them, because as they're laying on their stomach, I push them back, I go to pull them out of that position, their hamstring instantly seizes up. Most people do not have strength in that position. It's not a common position that we get into every day. but can be a great way to really strengthen your hamstring in a way that translates just a better function of this posterior chain. So in a simple way, if we just showed you on the ground, again, don't mind the mismatch of the PVC and the dowel. We're in that 90-90 position. I'm gonna radiate again, glutes, core, even push down into the ground with the poles, adjust them where I need them to feel comfortable. Flex, 3 seconds, and then relax. Just like the hip internal rotation, as we get into end range of motion, you get into that crampy sensation. Our muscles don't know how to hold these positions very well, right? They're not used to it. So rather than pushing themselves to failure, they'll often cramp and say, hey, you're gonna leave me alone here. Irradiate, create tension. 1, 2, 3, relax. Just like the other one, over time as I get better at this, I went to demonstrate this the other day and cramped up doing it higher, so I'm gonna be pretty conservative as I do it here. So just using the yoga block as opposed to anything higher. Engage, create tension. I hold 3 seconds and down. Over time, as I become better at that, I'm gonna build that up. I'm gonna make that higher. So as you get better, you continue to explore more range of motion. As opposed to going from the floor and lifting up 6 inches, I'm gonna elevate my foot and lift off that extra inch. Really explore that end range of motion. So those are some things that I recommend, some 3 exercises, right? We looked at lateral squat, could also do a lateral lunge, hip internal rotation, passive range liftoff, knee flexion, passive range liftoff. Those tend to be exercises that I'll add into people's programs based on the evaluation, based on their history. I always ask people, hey, what sports did you play as a kid? Did you play basketball or soccer or tennis? Did you move in different ranges of motion? I'll know, here, does this person have a really good foundation, or do we need to establish some type of foundation before we get them to be more specific to push towards their running goals? These are exercises I think would be good for everyone to try out, see how you do. Don't rush into the passive range liftoff exercises. You will get to a cramp and you might fall over and topple to the ground. Do those very conservatively at first, see how well you do, and then progress those over time. But I think those could be 3 great exercises to add into your program. They're 3 I think not a lot of people are doing or talking about, especially from a running standpoint. They're actually not typical exercises you would see for runners, but I think if we're really trying to create that base, right? In order to attain a higher peak, we must build a wider base. If we think about the proportions of a triangle or a pyramid that are proportional alongside, if I can create this really big base, good, healthy, functional movement, I can then over time achieve a higher peak, and that's what I want. Higher peak is better performance, less likelihood of injuries, and just overall moving and feeling your best. If you have any questions about these movements, feel free to drop a comment below, but I hope you enjoyed the video today. Thanks, everyone.